So we are just being put through the ringer here. You can see on Twitter the other day, Joseph mentioned that the launch version of Diablo will be a new version compared to what we had in the server slam, and we're gonna see balance changes and bug fixes. Bug fixes very, very common, okay? But they said balance changes here. Then it turns out responded saying the server slam build was not 0.9, but actually a version of our day one build. Okay, there's going to be very few changes between this build and the ones playing at launch. And then even to go further, someone asked here what version we got to play with the review build, and Joseph responded saying they're going to be playing, or they did play rather, the same version that the launch version will be. And even on top of that, Adam said that there's going to be performance optimizations and bug fixes on day one. So it seemed that this very few changes was going to be performance, bug fixes, optimizations, and things like that. But actually, according to a data mine from Wowhead here, we're actually getting some pretty massive buffs for Druid, and a few other things have happened. First off, we have the general legendary aspects. Any class can use these, and basically this one, accelerating aspect, got buffed from a duration of 3 to 5 seconds. Whenever we crit strike with our core skill, we're going to increase our attack speed. This one, it's an okay buff. Honestly, when you have general legendary aspects, what I've found is that you almost always don't use them unless there's some sort of damage reduction or defensive general aspect. The class-specific offensive aspects are almost always better, but I could see this being something interesting. You know, for some classes, getting that 25% attack speed could be interesting. We also have the Barbarian being nerfed, or rather, not the Barbarian, but the Barbarian aspect of Ancestral Echoes being nerfed. And they nerfed it by saying, instead of having just lucky hits damaging enemies with leap, upheaval, or whirlwind, have up to a 40 to 50% chance to summon an ancient. This now requires Call of the Ancients on your action bar, but it can happen more than once every 5 seconds. So the reason why I say this is kind of a nerf rather than a buff, because you're saying, oh, you can just proc it all the time. The problem is that you need Call of the Ancients on your action bar. You can't just have it skilled up, right? So I think that in general, the Barbarian is going to not want this on their bar later on in the game. This could potentially be a buff earlier on, but you're going to have the lucky hit, right? And this also changes a few of the builds, right? If you didn't want to run Call of the Ancients, but you potentially wanted to run this because you're running an upheaval or whirlwind build, then now you need it. So it kind of restricts build pathing, which, you know, is typically a pretty sizable nerf. But we get to go into the Druid, and the Druid actually has the biggest changes of them all, and they're actually pretty massive. So Cataclysm here, the lucky hit chance has been increased, and a massive storm now follows us for 10 seconds instead of 8 seconds. So the duration has been extended by 2 seconds. Pretty big. Petrify, the big AoE stun ultimate, now stuns instead of for 3 seconds for 3.75. And the duration of the crit strike damage bonus is now extended by 1.5 seconds, which is also a very, very big buff. But for me, this is where it gets interesting. Grizzly Rage now lasts for 12 seconds instead of 10 seconds. Now, this may not seem like much, okay? But this form gives you a ton of damage reduction, tons of bonus damage, and you also get scaling damage bonuses for as long as you are in this form, which means that this is really, really powerful to help you scale up the Druid. And in fact, my good friend DM, who's been playing the Druid, absolutely loves this skill. So this is actually a pretty sizable buff for the Druid, and I'm really excited to see that. Lacerate, same thing kind of as the Grizzly Rage. We're going to extend that duration by kind of 12 or 2 additional damaging hits. It's not really duration, but like this just does a bunch of hits, so you're kind of extending that as well. And then you're going to get some big damage increase, right? Another 25% damage increase on that ultimate hit. So a pretty sizable buff there as well. Across the board, the Druid received a ton of just extensions in terms of durations and potentially damage. Lacerate's more of a damage increase rather than a duration increase, I would say. But overall, very, very sizable buffs for the Druid. Rogue even got a buff here, and it's just buffing the dash damage, which doesn't really do much. 4% damage on the dash doesn't really change a whole lot, but you know, it could matter just for some passive damage increasing. And actually, necromancers got a pretty nice option with their golem. So you can see here the passive, you're protected by a golem with X life that attacks for 21% damage. And instead of shedding corpse, it absorbs 15% of the damage you would take and recovers life when attacking. And then when you activate it, instead of taunting nearby enemies and taking reduced damage, you're going to drain the blood of enemies in an area, dealing 40% damage and healing for 4% of its life for each enemy drained. Damage and healing received are tripled if only one enemy is drained. So what's interesting about this is the golem was already decently tanky. It wasn't like super tanky, but the extra damage that it's potentially taking, and it's actually going to give you a passive amount of damage reduction in conjunction with the ability to heal itself now, instead of just taunting and kind of killing itself. Now, this may not seem like a lot, but golem is one of those summons that tends to survive in the late game comparatively to the mages and the warriors. So when you get to late game, getting essentially 15% damage reduction, which I'm not quite sure if this multiplicatively stacks with damage reduction or if it's additively. I imagine it could potentially be additively, but that would be kind of strong. This is going to be really, really massive for the end game when you're starting to stack some damage reduction. So I actually think this is a pretty massive buff, the Necromancer. Not only that, but we also got a ton of changes to the elixirs here. But it looks like they didn't necessarily adjust the death evasion elixir, which is unfortunate. But for the most part, they basically increased the crit strike damage and reduced the crit strike chance for the precision elixirs. And that makes a little bit more sense. Getting 12% crit strike chance on an elixir is kind of nuts. And this is something that I was about to make a video on, actually, and I probably still will. Just keep in mind the elixirs, right? And the dodge elixirs here were reduced quite significantly as well. I'm surprised they didn't touch the death evasion elixir, but it is what it is. So overall, not bad. I think that the Barb is still going to run the game. I think that Druid potentially has some additional options. And I also think that Necromancer has some really, really nice ability to reduce damage with that golem later on in the game. Who knows though, maybe the golem will still get one shot, even with the ability to kind of, I guess you could say, have a higher health bar, but absorbing 50% damage, maybe you would have gotten one shot, now it does. But healing life and stuff like that could be interesting, right? It doesn't say it has a cap, so you could potentially heal for like 100% of your golem's HP if you time it right, although you don't want to do that because it would be dead. But other than that, guys, let me know what you think about this. It's pretty cool to see some changes. I was expecting nothing because, again, they said that they weren't going to do that. They were going to do some performance optimizations or very few changes. But to me, yeah, it might be very few changes, but it's still very impactful. So, pretty cool. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all for the next one.